Now I should be on. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we love you, we love your word, we love the chance to gather as your church and to grow in your word, and help us to do that this morning. Bless our time together, and we pray this in Jesus' mighty name. Amen. Okay, well, in addition to our normal resource, which really I've been just teaching through the Snell book, Acedia and its Discontents, we're going to also be using Jared Havener's Doctor of Ministry work, which is on the sin of sloth and acedia, and so his paper is called "The Sin of Sloth, Acedia in Monastic, Medieval, and Modern Life," and it is really, really good. I hope that he is able to publish it at some point. I wouldn't be surprised if he is. He's still not, I don't think he's through the final steps of review yet, but that's in process. And we'll be looking at some of Jared's work when I am teaching on sloth or acedia in Scripture in just a little bit. We'll see some examples this morning. Happy Palm Sunday. It's good to see everyone here on Palm Sunday. All right, so last week, kind of dealing with the question of work and vocation. So don't just think of the job that you go to, but vocation in life, how you spend your time, what your calling is in this world. And we saw that the vice of acedia suggests that we are here to consume. That's our main purpose in life, to consume, and the world exists for our consumption to satisfy our personal desires and freedoms, and our purpose then is to acquire goods and experiences in the hope of obtaining pleasure, and work, therefore, is a necessity, but kind of an unwelcome necessity that is, it's necessary because we have to earn money, but if we didn't have to earn money, then we could just then pursue pleasure and leisure and kicking back and living the good life all of our days. And so work is or vocation, I don't want to do it, and that's how so many approach work today, and it's part of the vice of sloth or acedia to look at work in that way. What we want to affirm is that work is a virtue, good work is a virtue, and the act of work itself is a reflection of the reality that we are here in this world to give of ourselves in love. So even if you're a student, your vocation at present is a student, your calling is you're giving yourself in love, not only to this work, but to others as you grow, because as a student, as you grow, you will one day be able to, and maybe already, assist others in light of what you're learning and how you're growing as a student. So the self-gift of work aims at the enrichment of our neighbor and the world. We're here to work, not consume. So work is an end, in a sense. We were made to work because through vocation, through work, we are living out then what it means to be made in the image of God. And everything God does is an act of self-gift for us, especially we see in his work of creation. So when we fulfill our calling and give of ourselves in whatever vocation it might be a mother at home, it could be a secretary, it could be anything, we are reflecting something of the image of God within us. And so the mandate to fill the earth and subdue it and exercise dominion over it is not a mandate for exploitation, but for self-giving love. You'll hear sometimes Christians are called dominionists, and you'll hear dominionism promoted among Christians. And okay, there are some things that are good there, but what you don't typically hear from Christians who call themselves dominionists is this idea of approaching God's creation in a vocation that is the vocation of self-giving love. Usually by dominionism, people think of ruling over to almost to the point of exploitation. But we want to think of cultivating an act of self-giving love in our work, in our vocation, in our calling. So we saw last week the ultimate purpose of work is not so much the objective good that it brings, although that is a purpose of work. We saw man is the purpose of work, in that through work we become who God intends us to be after his own self-giving image. Sloth or acedia hates the self-giving nature of work because it binds us to creation and hinders, just our freedom and consumption. That's how we want to live in our temptation. All right, so that was last week. Any questions or comments from last week before we move on? All right, I'm going to say a few things and try to go quickly here. Just some more orienting remarks in regard to the general sin of sloth and acedia and some of the ways it manifests itself. And then we're going to look at some biblical examples of this. And that's where Jared's work is particularly going to help us. So one of the things I've been trying to highlight, and I started this when we did a class a couple years ago on biblical interpretation, and we looked at modern means of interpreting the Bible versus more ancient means of interpreting the Bible. And I introduced us then to the idea of the old enchanted world that pre-modern man used to inhabit. And this becomes important when we're talking about how we interact and view the world today, because there is a difference between seeing the world as enchanted, not in a magical witchcraft kind of way, but as meaningful precisely because it was created by God, versus a disenchanted world, which is devoid of meaning, because when you look out in the world, all you see is that it is a collection of random atoms without purpose. All right? The pre-modern person lived in an enchanted world where meaning was thought to reside in things themselves, and the world was then full of meaning. And Bill sent me this paragraph from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's fictional work, Sir Nigel, which Bill says is very good, so I think he would recommend our reading of it. I know my kids have really liked Sherlock Holmes in reading it, and Doyle captures some of what is meant by an enchanted world in pre-modern days. And he says this, he says, "In those simple times there was a great wonder and mystery in life. Man walked in fear and solemnity, with heaven very close above his head and hell below his very feet. God's visible hand was everywhere, in the rainbow and the comet and the thunder and the wind." So the idea there is when you saw something like a rainbow, or when you felt the thunder and wind, there is something meaningful in that, especially concerning God's hand in it. "The devil, too, raged openly upon earth. He skulked behind the hedgerows in the gloaming. He laughed loudly in the nighttime. He clawed the dying sinner, pounced on the unbaptized baby, and twisted the limbs of the epileptic. A foul fiend slunk ever by a man's side and whispered villainies in his ear, while above him there hovered an angel of grace who pointed to the steep and narrow track." It's just pointing to the worldview that people lived in. How could one doubt these things when pope and priest and scholar and king were all united in believing them, with no single voice of question in the whole wide world? Every book read, every picture seen, every tale heard from nurse or mother, all taught the same lesson. And as man traveled through the world, his faith would grow the firmer. At every turn, he was made to feel how thin was the veil and how easily rent, which screened him from the awful denizens of the unseen world. Wow, what a great piece of literature in the Conan Doyle's writing there. But what a wonderful, imaginative perspective on the difference between those simpler times of pre-modern man and our present age, when all of that wonder and mystery and even terror at what the world holds has been sucked out and replaced by the cold, hard science. So that's the world we live in, cold, hard, meaningless science. Tolkien captures this as well, not quite as explicitly as Doyle, but just as imaginatively, as he creates the world of the Lord of the Rings. Tolkien, I think, is very deliberate in creating an enchanted world. So where things, stuff, has meaning in and of itself, precisely because of its created nature. So the forests in Lord of the Rings, 4 primary forests, have more character than human characters in many novels. Forests are almost living, breathing things. So many inanimate things in the Lord of the Rings have names because they bear in their existence an undeniable, meaningful essence. So you have these horns, these various horns that each have their own character and essence and sounds as they're blown and meaning as they're blown. And you have particularly, I think, of Glamdring, Gandalf's sword, or Orcrist, Thorin's sword, or Sting, Bilbo's knife. They're all given names because Tolkien is reflecting the idea that at one time the world was charged and full of meaning, and even objects, things, were to be respected because there is an awe and wonder at this world as it is created, weighty and meaningful by God. That's Tolkien's world. Now we could go into the biblical world and see very similar ideas. So when we might think of just the idea of light, and last week we saw the candles in Zechariah that represent the light of the church, which is the light of the world, which is a reflection of Jesus, who is the light of the world. And so part of the idea, if we're going to inhabit this biblical world that says to us that light says something about Christ, then every light we see and approach in this world, this is not pantheism, we're not worshiping the lights, but we understand that God has made this world and given us lights in this world to say something to us about the reality that Jesus is the light of the world, to orient us to Christ. So even these lights that everybody helped to change, not everybody, but many of you helped to change several weeks ago to finally illumine our sanctuary, and it's really nice in here, even they speak to us something of the reality, a greater reality beyond themselves. They carry meaning. And of course that reality is Christ himself. God didn't make the world just arbitrarily, we'll have some light here, and then decide what's a good analogy for who Jesus is in this world. That's backwards. He created the world after the reality of who he is, reflecting his glory, as the scriptures tell us. A seed, for example. My kids were working at the farm yesterday. Claire was transplanting plants for Mr. Morris, and these plants started as seeds. And when the Apostle Paul thinks of a seed, he's not like, well, maybe this could mean, Paul sees meaning in a seed that relates to what? 1 Corinthians 15. A seed is bursting with meaning and orients us to what? The resurrection of Christ and ourselves, the resurrection body. And And that's the biblical world where things like seeds and light have important meaning, and it is an enchanted world. And no wonder when we remove all of that from the world we live in today, so this is the world everyone is growing up in, no wonder people are lost in a kind of meaningless malaise. And and I don't want to suggest, this can sound like a rant against prior generation, like the current, what's wrong with kids these days, right? It can sound like a rant. That's not what we're saying. This isn't a generation to generation thing. This is a important moment that divides modern man from pre-modern man, so that as modernity took shape and science began to define things in whole new ways and create whole new worldviews, there was a shift, a fundamental shift in how humanity related with the world around it. And there are all kinds of implications then that have come with this shift. All right. So modern man occupies a disenchanted world where we assume things mean only what we assign to them. So we create the meaning. Again, when we get into gender, you'll start to see how this is possible. You create the meaning of what your sex is, male or female. It's just up to you to decide what that means. It could mean you could be born a male, but to you it could mean you're a female, and you create the meaning. You do that yourself. That's an example from gender, but in this world where it's up to us to create meaning, if we choose to, then what happens is we struggle to find the world beautiful or good or of worth. And then we also struggle to find worth in ourselves, which becomes one of the plagues of modernity as well, looking at oneself with disgust as we look at the world with disgust or confusion. And of course, all of this is done purposely to maintain our autonomous freedom, to do that, to be free, then we have to live in a world that has no weight. So it's kind of, if you want to be your own God, then you need a disenchanted world. So there's a real sense in which a lot of this is driven not just by, science denying the existence of God. It's driven by freedom, which is an idol of our age. All right, and this some practical results of this worldview manifest in sloth are a disgust at being, and it disgust at being, existence itself, because it is weightless, which leads to sleepiness, sickness, meaning unhealth, not that someone who's sick all the time, but someone who's just generally unhealthy because they have an unhealthy approach to the world around them. Inattentiveness, dissatisfaction, a feeling of tedium, restlessness, wanderlust, hatred for place, prideful and frenetic activity, floating from task to task, disgust at life itself. There is in this disgust at the world and at being itself a desire to escape and a longing even for alienation and isolation. You don't want connections with others or with the world. Acedia hates the good of the world because a good world charged with meaning constrains our freedom and demands attention, care, obligation, respect, and self-giving love. So there's a sadness at the good. Sloth feels sorrow at the prospect of communion with God, which is the ultimate divine good. So the idea of being linked to God in a loving, intimate union as a person's greatest happiness is what we should dream of and desire, but sloth rejects this joy as an unbearable burden. So it's interesting, the sadness of sloth rejects the joy that it should desire to move out of that sadness and chooses sadness instead. And part of the idea here is that any relationship requires commitment and an investment of oneself toward another. Any relationship restricts our freedom because in relation to others, that means we exist for others. So at the prospect of a friendship or relationship with God, which should be our greatest joy, the slothful becomes sad because it means the good and joy of a relationship with God is contrary to my desire to not be constrained by anything. And I'm certainly not going to be constrained by a relationship with God, so you just become sad at the good that God offers. And this sadness cripples action and mobilizes people. This is where, the more modern idea of sloth often dwells with someone who just is immobilized. But we want to understand that the heart of inactivity is not sinful laziness. It is sinful self-love, because the activity of work, of doing something, requires self-giving. And you don't love another to give yourself to another. You only love yourself, and that leads to this listless inactivity. The activity of relationships with God or others requires self-giving and commitments and restriction. So your identity and personhood is bound by others, defined by others, because you're giving yourself to them, and the slothful can't accept those constraining boundaries. So the prospect of good work or good friends or good action and giving oneself for another only saddens the slothful, when these are the very things that should bring them joy, since we are created after the self-giving image of our Creator. And as I've put here in the notes, they can't abandon themselves to others for the joy of giving themselves. It's just a sadness or bitterness that really distances themselves from others. And then for so many who are engulfed in sloth or acedia, there is a boredom as a kind of prison in which they live, a boredom at everything. And you'll see in the notes here, the term boredom did not exist until the 18th century, and it wasn't used regularly until the 19th century. Boredom is a phenomenon of the disenchanted world of modernity. When we think of boredom, we can think of two types of boredom. There's what can be called a situative boredom, which is common to man in every age. No matter when you lived, you end up in a long line and you're bored because you're just waiting and waiting and waiting for the line to end. And that's situative boredom. A date who drones on about only themselves. Lacey is perpetually in that situation, I think. No, I'm just kidding. But that kind of boredom, you understand that, and that's common to humanity in every age. But in our modern age, there is uniquely an essential boredom, which is a boredom not just at unique situations, but at everything, even and especially one's own self. So remember Adam's response to Eve. When God gives him to Eve, he is excited by this gift, and he says, at last, and that is then the approach to the world, not just Eve, but to this world that God has given to us as a gift, at last. And for those suffering acedia or sloth, instead of thrill or wonder at the world as given to us by God, there is only dull emptiness. We were talking with our family the other day. Lacey had, boy, I don't mean to single her out here, but she had never heard the term, the world is your oyster. You've never heard that? You never heard that? All right, well, so you're not alone. And you think of that idea that when people say the world is your oyster, the idea is who knows what treasure the world might hold that you discover unexpectedly even, and astonish you and magnify your joy. That's life in an enchanted world where we can say the world is your oyster. There's wonder out there. For our modern world, you know, I think a parallel phrase today would be the world is your Disneyland. That's about the best we can do, right? And what is Disneyland? It is a place of, I will go to Disneyland. If you buy me tickets and get me I will happily go and have fun. So I'm not here to knock Disneyland. I'm here to examine the reality that lies behind it. And what is Disneyland? It is a place of manufactured distraction that cannot ever bring deep and abiding joy. Everything is plastic or animatronic, and you might have fun times, but you will not be filled or fulfilled through the experiences that Disney provides. So, and you see it if you've ever been there, families walking out the gate in absolute chaos, distress, exhausted and empty from a fake world that was designed only to distract from the boredom we feel at the real world. There should be more enchantment in a blade of grass for ourselves and for our young people than a whole week spent at Disneyland, because a blade of grass carries meaning and weight that God has created that animatronics and plastic can't. So there's a boredom at the world, and we just have to distract ourselves by things like Disneyland. The world is no longer our oyster. And there's distraction. And I want to say that boredom is not a neutral stance. Boredom at the world is not a neutral stance. It is a heresy declaring that God was wrong when he saw the goodness of the world and declared the goodness of the world and created the goodness of the world. So don't think that boredom at the world is a neutral stance. It is a moral failure for us, we who were created to enjoy and to be given the goodness of this world as God has made it. All right. Any questions or comments at this point before we move on to some biblical examples? Giles.
I always thought of that. Thought about a pearl and an oyster. Well, a pearl and an oyster is because of a speck of dirt or some irritation came into that oyster, and that oyster reacted to it, covered it, and over time it became a pearl. And I just, that's the way the world is in terms of, we respond to something we aspire for, or we're dissatisfied, so we do something about it. That's what my father used. I complained about something. Well, what are you going to do about it? Anyway, that's my father.
I appreciate, and that's the idea that we find in the world a pearl and something that wow us with meaning. We're going to go into some biblical examples, and then next week will be our last week on acedia and sloth before we get into gender. Actually, next week is Easter, so it'll be in a couple of weeks. We won't have Sunday school next week. And then in that fourth and final week on acedia and sloth, we're going to talk about remedies for sloth. But let's look at some biblical examples. And this is all from Jared's work in his Doctor of Ministry project. And so is the idea of sloth in Scripture? Well, the word acedia, and acedia is a Latin word. The Greek equivalent is acedia. And acedia does not appear in the Greek New Testament. However, it is used 9 times in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, where it translates several different Hebrew roots connoting things like sorrow, anguish, faintness, and weariness. So that's consistent with the idea of sloth we've been seeing. And then there are some just examples of the idea, even though the word acedia is not there in the New Testament, the idea is very present there in different ways. Jesus, isn't it interesting? Jesus in his humanity, he needs the relationship of other people, especially in his great hour of need, which we will meditate on particularly this week, this Easter week. And he needs the connection of his friends there and his disciples, and they fall asleep when Jesus wants them to stay awake and pray alongside of him. So that's an example of acedia, where the commitment of relationship and the self-giving love it requires is rejected, and you just fall asleep instead and ignore the love you could give to for the disciples to Jesus at that moment. And then just some other, like the parables of the fig tree that will be cut down unless it bears fruit. So you think of it just a listless, bare tree that is supposed to bear fruit and to give of itself, but it doesn't give of itself. So it doesn't bear fruit, so it's cut down in judgment. The servant who buries his talents, what a powerful picture of sloth that is. He's afraid to use the talents, to invest them, to put them to work, and he is chastised for that. The many people, it says the man, but the many people whose hearts have grown dull and who have shut their eyes and unable to understand Christ's teaching. So this dullness that blinds you to the meaning of what Christ is saying. And then you have more direct warnings against idleness and exhortations to work. But particularly, there is the rich ruler. Think of him as he approaches Jesus, and he's interested in following Jesus and gaining the salvation that Jesus offers, and Jesus confronts the man with the demands of love. And what are the demands given to the rich ruler that Jesus asks him to do? To sell everything and give it to the poor in Mark 10. And he's asking him to love his neighbor, is what Jesus is asking him to do, which makes demands on himself. And he's asking him to love God in obedience to God's commands. And Jesus then says, then come and follow me. And isn't it interesting, the rich ruler's response is sadness, sorrow. His response to Jesus in verse 22, disheartened by the saying, he went away sorrowful. This is sloth's response to the joy that is offered in the gospel of Christ. Jesus offered him joy, the joy of loving one's neighbor, which of course requires a self-gift. For him, it required everything. And he chose sorrow instead, a sadness, because he did not want to give of himself. That is a wonderful, it's a devastating picture of the kind of sloth in relation to vocation, love to neighbor that we're looking at. He chose inactivity, doing nothing, sitting on his wealth, instead of giving of himself in love. In the Old Testament, go to a variety of places. Psalm 119:28 says, my soul melts away for sorrow. In the Septuagint, the Greek translation, it says, my soul has slumbered because of acedia or acedia in the Greek. And in this psalm, this verse particularly, the Desert Fathers in Christian tradition have kind of focused on this particular verse to come up with a definition of acedia as a slackness of soul, a dullness of soul. And it connects acedia to this internal sorrow. My soul melts away for sorrow. That threatens one's spiritual progress and growth. And that was the work of the monk, spiritual progress and growth. But when their soul slackened or slumbered or dulled, they were in danger of not fulfilling who they were created to be. And the counter then to that comes in verse 32 of the same psalm, when the psalmist says, I will run in the way of your commandments when you enlarge my heart. It's an awesome picture of a dull, saddened, disheartened person being made alive and running after the commandments of the Lord. It's the exact opposite of the rich ruler, right? He did not run after Christ because he didn't want to do what that required. Instead, he walked away with a dull, sad soul. And that's a picture of acedia. Lot and his wife in Genesis 19, when Lot was commanded to leave the city, it just says the angels come, get out of here. It's going to be destroyed. Lot is sluggish. It says in Genesis 19:16, simply, but he lingered. He didn't go anywhere. He didn't do anything. Just gonna, that's sloth, right? And why did he linger? Calvin, in interpreting this, says that Lot's failure to act was a reflection of the words of Christ in Matthew 26:41, where Jesus says, the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And so Lot remained idle when he should have acted. And mercifully, Lot and his family were seized by these angelic men and led out of the city, despite Lot's culpable inaction. And then his wife expressed a sorrow over the good that God was offering to them. She was sad to leave her former life in exchange for the good that God promised her, a new life. So she looked longingly back and became a pillar of salt. And she was expressing in that looking back a sadness over something good, a longing to go back, and instead of joyfully obeying not only God's commandment, but receiving the blessings of new life that God was offering them. This is also reflected in Israel's life in a very profound way. And this is probably the most common biblical reflection that Christian tradition goes to when it looks at the sin of sloth. And that is Israel's refusal to enter the promised land in Numbers 13 and 14, and then also Deuteronomy 1. So Israel collectively as a people embodies acedia by refusing to enter the place of God's promised blessing. They refuse spiritual good on account of what it requires of them, which is faith and trust and a self-giving love to the Lord. So let's see where we are here. Okay. Numbers 13:32. The spies, the scouts, brought to the people of Israel a bad report, a false report of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants. So that's a report the scouts bring back. This is the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey, that is going to be the joy of God's people. And they go out and look at the land, and they're like, nope. We don't want this. We don't want anything to do with this. And so the scouts bring back a bad report. And in their report, they're suggesting that the very thing that God had promised them was actually a threat to their existence, a threat that if they go pursue these promises of God, actually what's going to happen is they're going to be devoured. And God's promises would devour them, not bless them. And thus they became sad at the good, at the promises of God. And they're sad at the promised land itself. So in Deuteronomy 13 and then going into 14, they weep in sadness when they're at the edge of the promised land. And instead of longing for the good that God promises, what do they long for now? 14:3, they long to go back to slavery in Egypt. They say it would have been better if we just turn around right now and go back to Egypt. And they even say, they even make a plan. Let's appoint for ourselves a leader, a new leader. Sorry, Moses or Joshua. It's fun while it lasted, but let's bring a new leader who will take us back to Egypt. So what's happening there at a deeper level? Israel is refusing a life of faith and love, refusing the goodness of God's blessings, and actively choosing despair and sadness. They're weeping because they don't want what God promises them. It's almost as if God's promises are maybe too good to be true for them. They fear the good and what it means. God is telling them and showing them, you are a beloved people, but that means they must act like a beloved people. And they have chosen to be a despised people under the Egyptians instead. And this is why part of acedia and sloth is a form of self-hatred, because that's what they've chosen, to be a despised people instead of a beloved people. Now, the reason that they eventually cross is because God himself intervenes by manifesting his glory presence, and which gives them a little kick to eventually go over. And from another angle, to see the ridiculousness of this. The scouts, at one point, they bring back a cluster of grapes from the promised land so large that it takes 2 men to carry it. So they're like, look at this fruit that we've got here. It's awesome. It's the abundance of good that God is promising to his people. It's just a picture of how good God is. But they refuse to accept God's gift to them. And so it's an act of extraordinary rebellion. In some ways, that act of refusing God's gift parallels through the fruit, parallels a similar act but almost it mirrors an opposite act in the creation account, when instead of refusing God's good gift, they refuse God's boundaries and eat the fruit they shouldn't have eaten in the Genesis creation account. Here, they refuse the fruit and the goodness that God promises them. And then there's the sluggard of Proverbs, he's commanded and he doesn't just show up in Proverbs 6, he shows up in many different ways. We don't have time to go into him, but he's commanded to go to the ant, learn from the ant who is industrious and who reaps the good of the creation around it. And how long will you lie there, O sluggard, when will you arise from your sleep? Now, importantly, the sluggard cannot be reduced to a lesson about laziness, because the opposite of sloth is not hard work. Remember, it is love. Good work is an act of love, so the opposite of sloth is love. And the sluggard's failure is a moral issue related to those commandments of God, to love neighbor and to love God. All right. I hope some of those biblical examples were helpful as we are dealing with admittedly difficult ideas to grasp completely, but that's what I have right now. So we'll have a time of discussion good luck, Brandon and Stephanie, bringing that into discussion with our young people. And we'll let you guys go. Again, next week we're going to look at some remedies, and then we'll get into gender the following time. All right. Any questions, thoughts, discussion thus far? You can relate them to some of these questions I've asked here, or you can have bring your own ideas. Giles.
Yeah, about the spies, I always wondered, how old were they? You know, were they 60 years old? Some of them. I mean, would they remember parting of the Red Sea, the water coming out of the rock, God's provision of meat and manna, and yet they had this attitude? You know, or maybe they were young and didn't experience all those extraordinary events. But it seemed to me that how could they take that position after God so wonderfully provided for them, even while they were in the wilderness and leaving Egypt? Just, you know, and that was my, when I read that, I thought about that. I go, I wonder how old were those guys? Didn't they learn from their folks or anything? And that was my thought.
Dave.
Yeah, along those lines, I was trying to reconcile that too, and I come to point number 1 there, that section, where it says, they refused the spiritual good on account of the work they required. So God was giving them a promised land, but they still had to work for it. It was hard work. And I see that directly, I see how that directly relates to us today. Spiritual good requires hard work, whether it's ministering to people or whatever. Even our own spiritual growth requires hard work.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And some of the work here in view, in going to the Promised Land, is, I think, partly the hard work of faith, of trusting God and turning yourself over to Him and believing that He really will do good for you. And I think we can even define faith in a work in that sense, not a work that merits or earns salvation, but an active faith that trusts in God is for someone who would rather be independent and unbound to anyone. It is a hard thing to do. In addition to growing in the fruit of the Spirit, for example, hard work, and not something that that is easy to do in many other ways. Kevin.
Been 65 years old, been coming to church for 40 years under Christ, as far as in faith. And we talk about the fellowship and by the Lord providing us with a structure of fellowship. It provides us with a greater opportunity to pursue what we sit and talk about every Sunday. And 40 years later, we continue to talk about the same things. We give them a different face, we give them a different meaning, not meaning, but a sense of meaning through history, through books, through people, through matters that have been faced for hundreds of years, thousands of years. And like what Giles said, how could those people a few thousand years back see that and not say, wait a minute? The same reason why we don't. Because of the garden, because of the fall, and because you can't redefine what the Lord has provided us. You can only chase the truth as He has provided us with that understanding. And we can just as easily be as callous as we can make other people that we call callous about what we talk about every Sunday, and we continually fall on our face. Nothing more than just, you think about it, just so easy to be neutralized by that, compromised by that, but that's precisely why we're supposed to be in fellowship with one another, to not be, because that's the only way we can find that hope.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. These examples of acedia often come in Scripture from God's own people. They're not sins that are out there in the world. They're sins that exist, temptations that exist within the church. So we ourselves face a temptation that is amplified because of this disenchanted world that we live in. It's amplified today, I think, but a temptation to reject God's promises in favor of a sorrow of a weightless existence, temptation to be our own gods in essence. Terry.
I was thinking about a different vein. In this country, people falling away from the church or quit reading the Bible, it seems like there's no North Star to look at to point you in the right direction. So the end of Judges, where it says everybody did right in their own eyes, it seems like that's today. It's kind of scary too that, out in the world that people are just, doing right in their own eyes.
I think, reflecting back on Calvin was that those men, I've always looked at that text in Numbers, spy out the land is, but I've not looked at it through the sea, or blatant and shocking unbelief. But I see what you're saying. It's also sort of a seedy in that they just didn't want to do it. They want to do what God had commanded them to do. And I've always seen a shocking unbelief because all of them, I think, were older. Caleb, 40 years after that, well, about 40 years after that, the road was wandering. And Caleb, when he got into the promised land, he said to Joshua, he says, I'm 85 years old, and as strong as I was after Moses called me, I think he came back to go into the promised land and spy it out. And Joshua also spied it out. So those men had come out of Egypt and had seen the water parted and the pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire. They had seen all that. But the majority of them said, this is, I think, what you're saying, seedy company, they said, oh, we don't want to do this, it's too much. So I think they were all people who had seen what God had done, the manna and the quail and all that.
When I was talking about that, the promised land, well, who promised it? God. And, and that speaks to our reliance on God's promises. The contrast was the spies and Abraham. Abraham so put his trust in God's promise that he was willing to sacrifice Isaac, believing in the resurrection, because Isaac was the way to the great nation that God promised Abraham. And God promises us a lot. How much do we put store in those promises?
Yeah, that act of faith from Abraham was definitely not sloth. It was an extraordinary action. I think of just the cultural realm in which we're living, and this part of what this does, not only should we see ourselves affected by these things because this is the world we live in, And we can't, these are the waters we swim in, and you can't float above and say, I'm going to escape all of this. I think we should see ourselves tempted by these same things, but I also think we should see the extraordinary difficulty of something like evangelism in a world like this, where the good that God offers, the trend is to reject that good, not even because you don't believe in God, or but because you don't want that good. You're going to make good for yourself, or define what is good for yourself. And in doing that, you're always going to fail. That's why there is that emptiness and weightlessness to the world. You're always going to fail. But that's the mindset that we're living in the cultural context, which means we need the Spirit to change hearts and to help us. And it means that we need to exhibit the calling to vocation as joyful self-giving to others, so that others say, where does that come from? Your joy in serving your neighbor in this hard job that is marred by sin everywhere. You're fighting against that sin as an act of rebellion against the darkness of this world. Explain to me why you're doing that. So we have, I think, extra responsibilities because of the realities of cultural situation in which we live. All right, well, in a couple of weeks, no Sunday school next week, but in a couple of weeks, next week is a breakfast. In a couple of weeks, we'll look at some remedies, and then we'll get into gender the week after that. So we'll see you in worship.